My name's Nikki Madigan, and I'm the curator here at the Pemberton Museum. Thanks for coming today. This is the third Teen Tales of the season, and this year's theme is in the first person. So what we're trying to do is bring forward stories from the archives and also stories that people have gathered around their family histories to bring those stories forward into today. So we've been reading autobiographies and exploring some stories from, last week's story was from 1958. This week we had a happy coincidence of wanting to talk about Gunnar and Marjory Gimse at the museum here, and the Gimse family just happened to be having their reunion this past weekend. So earlier in the season, Teresa Smith had approached us looking for some information about the Gimse family, and I said, we sure have a lot of information, and would you be interested in presenting at Teen Tales in August during your reunion? And she happily agreed. So thank you for coming today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Marjory Gimse is an important person for the museum because she was the first president of the Museum Society. So she was president from 1982 when the society was first established, all the way through to 1992, so the first decade. And today's museum is still very much based on the efforts of that first decade. They actually built a museum on the other side of town, over where Rona is, that first site. And it was in '92 that these lands were given to the museum, and then the efforts started to bring the collection over here. So that first decade was key to the beginning of the museum and ensured its survival then through the next 3 decades, because this is the 35th year of operations. The other thing I wanted to tell you about Marjory is she is the daughter of Geoffrey Downton, and Downton envisioned the Bridge River Power Project, which is located up in Seaton, so it's not something many of us here in Pemberton think about too much. But he envisioned the potential for electric power if it was dropped 1,000 feet between the Bridge River Valley and Seaton Lake. And it wasn't until the 40s that that project finally got some funding, and the provincial government got involved. But that project powered Vancouver, and there was enough power left over to also ship down to the States and power the Boeing plant in Washington. So Geoffrey Downton was a legal surveyor, and he had the honor of pressing the start button at the Bridge River Power Plant when it finally turned on in 1947. And today the Bridge River Power Plant is being refurbished, so the dream continues, and they are continuing to make pretty massive changes to that power project even this year. So Teresa is the Gimse family history expert, but she's also in our local museum membership. She'd be our genealogy expert. She has a lot of experience using Ancestry.com, those types of sites. She's gone to archives even in Europe to research family history. So if any of you are thinking of going down this path or have been doing that, she's also available here today to talk to you about how to go about that. So thanks for helping us out today, and I'll turn things over to Teresa. She's got a few photos to share with you and some stories about Marjory and Gunnar Gimse.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Teresa Smith. I know a few familiar faces in the room. I did grow up here in Pemberton. I moved away a few years back and had a few children and went from there. And I mean, a lot of what Gunnar and Marjory were in the valley is it's a very large valley, and there's a large sort of old family feel in the valley. And I'm going to start with Gunnar because, well, he was about 15 years older than Marjory, so his story starts a little earlier. Gunnar here, his mother has an exhibit in the museum. Sigrid was a dentist, and they came from Norway. Sigrid and Carl, he was a lawyer, had a lovely home, Longboat, which had sort of a mirror effect, and it had a beautiful large estate, and on one side she had her dentist's office, on the other side he had his lawyer's office, and they worked from home. Their children were homeschooled, just not because they were not liking the local school. They actually decided that the reputation of the school wasn't as up to par, and so they had their children homeschooled. So Grandpa says he didn't actually get to go to school until he was in grade 4, and he was much smarter than the other children. And if you'd met Gunnar Gimse, you could hear him saying that. They did end up coming to Canada. Carl was a lawyer and had made some investments that didn't really work out, with the market falling in the 30s, or the 20s. It hit into Norway a bit earlier. So he decided to come to Canada, and he came in 1925. He first started in Ontario, and then moved out to Mission, and finally settling and purchasing some land in Richmond. Lulu Island is now, I believe, the city of Richmond. And at that point, he'd heard about some work up in Pemberton, and that's when Carl decided to come up here. Gunnar came with his dad in 1927, so Carl had come in 1925. It was a couple years later that Sigrid and Sissel had come. But going back to Gunnar, he was a bit of a rambunctious small child. He was actually one of the largest children born in that area of Norway at almost 12 pounds. So in 1910, you can only imagine having a very large child. He was over 11 pounds. So, you know, he was a very large man, and he was quite proud of that. He was very strong. He could try and give you a good handshake, and it hurt quite often. You were careful. His favorite story, he would tell us stories in his chair. And one of his favorite stories was about the age of 10, he traveled to Africa via Paris. And he remembered coming home, and Uncle Albert, and his uncle, his mother's cousin actually, that was living in Paris, had let him drive in Paris at 10. So he comes home all excited to tell his mother about their day. Much to her dismay, he had been driving all over Paris. So he was like, well, I've been driving since I was 10. And then when he came to Canada, he said, all I had to do was tell him I could drive, and he gave me a driver's license. So he was a fun guy. And he really did enjoy adventure. And so to have, you know, this life in Norway, he had running water and power the year he was born, to Pemberton in 1927. Well, we all know, I think the power came here in 1951, Pemberton, and that had a lot to do with the Bridge River project, which we'll kind of touch on in a little bit. So to have that sort of decision to emigrate to Canada and to have this totally different life, and his mother learning how to do laundry and cook and all of that once she came to Canada. And then have a practice here as well. So having started not in the Pemberton Valley, they kind of got a good look at the country, coming from Ontario and across. So once he came here, he said, no, this is beautiful. And once he'd done 2 Pemberton floods, he's like, okay, if you've been here for a Pemberton flood, they're quite momentous. I even remember one, and I was about this big. So, so they decided to move up to Birken. And we found this lovely little place, the Thompson home, a little valley overlooked beautiful fields. And my great-grandmother still enjoyed these big rocks that truly overlook, and I wish I could actually put a photo of the farm. And Gunnar, I mean, he was a hard worker. He milled lumber. They had a lumber mill, and he employed the locals. And they did ties for the railway, so that's quite a lot of wood that's daily going off. So they actually built a place in Mars Crossing that they could, in fact, ship into the States and into Vancouver. I'm sorry, my notes are a little messy as my printer had an ink. So I was like, oh, I gotta write this down. So he was quite a rambunctious young man, and he had spent most of his time up the valley with his sister and her family, and then I believe an engagement or two. I'm not too sure on how many, but And then moved out to Birken. My grandmother was born in 1925, so she was born 2 years prior to him coming to Canada. So she was born in Lillooet to Geoffrey and Winifred Downton. And they had come from England, and Geoffrey Downton had actually come to Canada in 1912 and was the land surveyor for Lisi government. He surveyed quite a lot of the area and had realized the possibility of the Bridge-Ridger project quite early on, about 1913. Unfortunately, the government was like, yeah, okay, we'll get around to that, maybe. So, like Mickey was saying, that project didn't actually go into the 40s. But Marjory and her brother, Murray, and their eldest sister, Audrey, were born in Lillooet. Though Marjory and Murray were taken to England for about 2 years until they were about full years, until she was about 7 years old. The one thing Granny had, I remember a story of her telling me is, as a small child, when she got to England, the first thing she had to do was change her voice because she was harassed for her accent. She had a Canadian accent. She remembers when she got there, she was about 6, and no, that wasn't going to work. She had to quickly change it. And they thought about sort of leaving the children in boarding school in England, but decided no, that they were Canadian and they would come home. They came back around, she was about 7, just over 7, and then immediately realized that she had changed her voice, because the Canadian children immediately were giving her a hard time about her English accent. So she was quick for change. She understood that you know, she would live up to par. She had some dental work needed. She'd been in Lillooet, and this lovely lady, Sigurd Gimse, had come into town, but she was too tired to work on my grandmother, so said, you come up to Birken and you can get some dental work done there. She came out for the weekend, and this lovely gentleman to her left wined and dined her. She did get the dental work done on the last day before she went home. About 4 years later, they were married. They were married in Vancouver. It was a quick, rushed-off wedding. They decided that they would get married in Vancouver, not in Lillooet, where her family was from. And they rushed off and then got married in, I've written it down, in Vancouver, came home and had an 8-day trip to Tankwa as their honeymoon. I don't know if you've been to Tankwa. It's a beautiful little lake. My 10-year-old daughter and my husband actually went last night for an overnight, and said they have a beautiful book up there. I think Lexi Ross did it. And her photograph that she's actually, you have a copy of here, of Tankwa Cabin is prevalent in a book at the cabin itself. So she was quite proud that my daughter's name is Marjory. So that's my namesake. I'm her namesake. So she's very, very much, you know, they decided to get married. They off they went and decided to do their trip to Tankwa. But sort of going back to Marjory, she got married young, and unfortunately for her, she grew up in Lillooet, and they called the home Springfield Place. Beautiful big gardens and lots of work to do. So that took her away from the kitchen, because she didn't really want to learn how to cook. So she did a great job at learning how to garden, which her mother decided was good because it would keep her busy. Unfortunately, when she was learning to get married, she had never learned how to cook. This caused some issues for her husband, as she could not cook at all. And bread was even just not. So Grandpa made the bread, and they survived. And Granny did slowly learn how to cook. But she was an amazing gardener. And I mean, as many of you know, she really did know her way around plants. With Springfield Place, it was a little bit further away in the little region. It's quite a bit more dry, so she had to learn how to garden in our climate. But she really did enjoy it. When they were first married, they lived in Whispering Falls, out near Birken on Gates Lake. There was a little tiny cabin, and it was tiny, and it might be there under a bramble bush. I'm not actually kidding, it's really not that large at all. And they were there for the first 4 years of their marriage. And then they moved to one of the cabins that were built for the lumber camp near 8 Mile Creek. And 8 Mile Creek, now known as Gimse Road, there's a tiny little sort of delta where we had about 10 cabins built. And they lived there for about a year, and then built a lovely home for Gunnar's parents, who were living at the Birken house, a smaller home for them, and moved into the big farmhouse. And then the addition of a few more children, and they've got up to there's 6 kids. They were quite young, again, when she met her father, or her husband. And when she got off the train in Birken, my grandfather had decided to pick her up in his convertible Chrysler. So it was, you know, I think love at almost first sight. A dashing young Norwegian man in a Chrysler convertible in Birken. He was well known for his cars. So I'm sure we've got the moon car and the other cars. And my dad could probably give a little more on the cars, but she was young. They did have to wait until she was 18 to get married, as for her father's instructions. But between 1944 and 1958, they did have 6 children. I think I have a photo of their 6 children. There's Grandpa. These actually, these photos that he's holding up, that is actually his trip to Africa when he was a child. And his grandmother, or his mother's cousin, went with them and wrote a diary. It has been translated and transcribed into English, and I do have a copy of that. So it's actually quite a good shot of my grandfather and his story, telling us stories about Africa. And oh, Tom's house. So this is the moon car here. This is one of his famous cars. And this is what the farmhouse was in the beginning. So this is, I believe, in the early 40s, late 30s. Oh, that was 2014. We grew a few.
Is that the image you remember?
No, I was looking for the one with the 6 kids. Nope. That one. So you've got 5 on this side here, and then my Auntie Teresa. But Heather, Carl, Pat, Jeff, and Anne, and Tira. She didn't make it to that reunion, unfortunately. So they were born between 1944 and 1958. So she wasn't sitting idle this time. She decided, with the expertise from her father, she learned how to do a market garden. So we had a very large garden, and I'm sure my father could attest that it was a lot of work. But the one thing about Birken was it didn't have power. It didn't have running water. I think water came in about 1956 when they put on the kitchen and the bathroom. And power didn't come until 1968. Marjory was the integral part of the committees, I believe, that decided they needed power. They were having the Bridge River power go through the valley, and said, hey, if it's going through, maybe we could get a little bit of it back. So she was an integral part of sort of pushing to get the power to go up the valley into Birken and on to Darcy. Or the other way around. I'm not quite sure how that went. She was a voting house. Birken House was a voting, so if you lived in that area and you needed to vote, you went to Marjory, and she was the person who would register you and make sure that you had voted in all your municipal elections. And she then started her seedlings. So she would do a seedling sale every spring. And I remember that as a small child growing up. You know, the greenhouse was bustling, and there was one day where you literally couldn't cross the lawn because there were so many people. And I do remember being told a lot of places, don't do this, get this. But yes, she was the first president of the Museum Society in 1982. And she felt that family history really was important, and it's very important to me as well. It's one of the things I've pursued because of Granny's family love for family, and just the knowledge of where did our families come from. And I do actually have her family history back into as far as I can go, which is quite far back, the 1600s for sure. So it's very much. Now this is a quick photo of my cousins. This is an event we had this weekend. This is actually the only photo I have of this weekend so far. My camera wasn't working, so I had to email a cousin. Give me a photo. This is the first time we've all actually been together. Every single one of us is in this photo. Ironically, we are in birth order, and we have a few years between us. The last one was born in 1984, and the first in 1962. So, but we've never all been in the same place before. Because of our lives, we've kind of all been everywhere. And the one thing when making the reunion for this weekend that I emphasized was, if we can have one generation that's all here, let's make it happen, and it did. So to have 20 of us all show up was pretty awesome. And this is about the only time frame we could take the photo, because we did have people arriving and leaving at different times. So, for Marjory and Gunnar, family was important, and of that we have 82 people that are direct descendants of Marjory and Gunnar, because we have 51 of our children from that 20. And this is taken in 2014 in front of Birken House, and we had a couple of plaques made up for them. And this is just a small portion. There's a bunch missing. So this year's photos haven't quite made it to my inbox, but we will be getting them done soon and again. So it's quite shocking how fast it's grown, but it is definitely a very integral part of BC's history with her father and with Sigrid. I mean, she was one of the most, in the Pemberton area, she was a working dentist quite early on. So I guess basically I'm trying to say, I've got a lot of history in the Birken area. Pool Creek, we were discussing that. So we've got some Marjory and Gunnar were very much part of this community and made it into our family, how integral it was to be a part of the community and to carry on the family legacy. And believe it or not, we only have 2 young Gimse boys out of the entire group. We have a lot of girls in our family, but we have 2 to carry on the name Gimse. But we've made a point of kind of coming back to visit the area. So I know that the Ross family, Cecil, our sister, is in the Pemberton area, and we would like to, I do have our family history for that entire family as well. That's sort of my little blurb on Marjory and Gunnar. A little bit rambly, my notes are a little messed up, my intro going off on me, but...
I have a question.
Yes.
When you were doing your family research, how did you get information? You seem to have a lot of information about things that had happened overseas before they came. So tell us a little bit about how you got that.
Well, overseas, the nice thing with Gunnar and Marjory is both of their families were quite wealthy. And with that, they had time to write their family history and take photographs. Also, in England and in Norway, the archives are absolutely amazing, whereas I have access to everything from census reports from the 20s back to insurance claims. So if you had a household insurance, you listed your contents insurance. They had that back then as well. So I had contents insurance from 1900 for Norway. They had their fire in the 1920s. They lost their first house in Norway, so they built a second one. But during that, there was also documents, in Norwegian of course, that listed insurance stuff. So that kind of comes from that. We have a bajillion photos, which I wish, unfortunately, I was the one who organized the reunion, so I've been a little busy. And I unfortunately did not have enough time to put together a bit more of a slideshow for today's event, and I wish I had, because I do have photos dating back into the mid-1800s from the Gimse and the Jackson and Downton families. So, I mean, my information is coming from first-hand photographs and family histories written by Marjory and Gunnar's family from that time. So that was very helpful when researching as well. Also archives. I mean, the archives are amazing to go into and microfiche. I spent a lot of time in the dark rooms staring at whiteboard.
Are you able to read Norwegian? Or?
I can kind of read Norwegian. Norwegian's very nice is that English and Norwegian both use German root words, okay, or vice versa. So if you can, a lot of words are very similar in some respect. It's not too hard, but there's a lot, and thankfully Google Translate is also very kind to me. So at the end of the day, find someone who speaks the native language and you're good to go. But it can be, there are days you're like, I don't know what this says.
What's your personally, what's your favorite memory of Marjory and Gunnar?
My favorite well, actually the photo of my grandfather, I would spend many hours listening to my grandfather tell us stories of his childhood. Gunnar spoke 5 languages, and with that, he was very proud of that. And so he would give you a story as to why and how he learned each language. Their Norwegian school system is a little different. So they did actually have to learn quite a few languages in school, English being one of them. And he would sit in his chair and with all the photo books that we had in the family, and he would tell us the stories of behind all of the photos. So for Gunnar, that was my favorite memory. Marjory was, well, my favorite time ever, a very vivid memory is the first time she actually swore the first time, and I know she'd hate me for saying this, but she made a Norwegian Christmas cake, and it was a marzipan cake. And any of you who've ever baked marzipan, it's a bit challenging, and I distinctly remember I was very small and would hear Marjorie swearing at this cake, thinking, wow, but actually sitting in her kitchen, though she couldn't cook as a young wife and mother, she learned how to cook, and she became a very good cook. And actually our giveaway for the family reunion this year, I built a cookbook that sort of just encompassed all of our family recipes into it. And actually, I believe you have copies of these, but in each of the dividers, I was able to place her drawings that she had made for, this one's of the Thompson Gimse house. For the museum has copies of these. And on the back of them, I did little, her recipe cards. So, you know, I mean, sitting in her kitchen and just chatting with her. She ended up cooking a lot. I mean, she had 6 children, batch of grandchildren. There are 51 of us. And, you know, we ate her out of house and home. So she cooked a lot. She got better at it. But
she strikes me as someone who is very industrious. You know, when I was going through the meeting minutes, that first decade in the Museum Society really did a lot. That first decade, like they had to wire the lands and move buildings and wire them, and oh, now the roof's leaking, and what do we do?
She taught.
And they went to museum conferences, and there was notes in the meeting minutes from going to these conferences. And
you could read her writing?
Some of it, a lot of it was typed. She wasn't the secretary, she was the chair at the meetings. But, you know, somewhere in there she also created these calendars, the museum calendars, using these pen and ink drawings that she did of old buildings around Pemberton. And if it weren't for Marjorie's drawings, to be honest, we wouldn't have any documentation of some of these buildings, because we don't have photographs. So her contributions, though it sounds like she was also very busy at home, she did all of this as a volunteer. And I understand too, she was looking after Gunnar towards the end, who was also ill.
Gunnar had
in health. And I think I never met her personally, but her fingerprints are all over this museum, that's for sure.
Well, and she was very much, I would never actually, you didn't want to cross her. I mean, if she was very industrious, and living in Birken, they made their own butter. They had no power until 1968, so they had to. I mean, it was a homestead, and it was a trip to come into Pemberton. It wasn't just we'll go in for an hour and grab the mail and come back out. It was okay. We're going to Pemberton tomorrow. You know, what do we need? Because we're not going back. And the road has definitely changed a little since then. But she enjoyed art. She was an amazing artist, and she did pastel, she did pen and ink, and so she did find the beauty in everything. And even, you know, said when she had this large family and she was, you know, doing her laundry with the gas washing machine, which to me kind of scares me a little. She still found the time to sit down and draw a picture. She still found the time to sort of invest in the community. And I think that came from with her parents coming from England and her father saying, you know, he had actually quite, his commission was in the Royal Navy in 1887, or 1905. So he commissioned a masted ship. And he moved through the Navy as it went from masted ship into steamship, into navigating by sea into land surveying. So he came like to Canada, and he decided he wanted to have sort of that hard work and really pursue that. And that's one of the reasons he came to Canada. So to have that sort of that work ethic that her family and she had, she really pushed it into the things she did. And I mean, she worked in a hardware store at Hardacres, and she also was around the community as well. One of the things one of my aunts was saying over the weekend was they had a freezer in Mount Currie because they couldn't plug a freezer in Birken. So she would have to think about dinner and go to the freezer in Mount Currie before she could prepare meat that she had frozen. So, you know, when you have to think about that, I mean, it's hard enough for me to go to the basement someday. I'm going to have dinner. I don't know, to have to think about going to Mount Currie to get my meat, that would be a little bit more planning. And, I mean, we've got so many things that we take advantage of now in sort of modern life. I mean, our phones are our lifelines. But back then, you know, you sort of couldn't just pick up the phone, or it wasn't until, I mean, it was 1977, my sister was born, when they still had the crank ring system through to Darcy. My mother was still in hospital sleeping when the entire Darcy Birken Valley knew what my sister was. Because who rings my grandparents at 3 a.m. when Susan's gone in to have a baby? Everyone picked up the phone. Mom woke up and they're like, "Oh, I hope you're mine," but the valley knows. My mother didn't even know. So, you know, it's stuff like that. We're, you know, explaining to the kids, and they're looking at those things and like, "What's this? It's a telephone." Are you sure? It has no numbers on it. Wow. So, I mean, that was sort of the tenacity, even, but in all of the Pemberton community up here, and Birken and Darcy, if they chose to live out here at that time, it was not an easy life. They had to work really hard to sort of get, you know, every little convenience that we now have. Though I'm not gonna lie, when I go to Mom and Dad's in Birken, there is still no cell service, and it is nice. I come to Pemberton, my phone just freaks out a little bit every time. So, you know, I think Marjory and Gunnar really, you know, they found a little piece of paradise out there, and they made it a home that, I mean, we come back to. And this weekend, we had well over 100 people.
We heard you.
And it there was a few of us. And it was all family. There was a couple, maybe 4 people that were not actually married in or born from at the reunion. So realistically, yeah, it was quite a few. There was a few of us. I'm surprised you didn't hear more of us. But yeah, and I mean, Marjory is very much, you know, my memory of her is actually in her greenhouse, constantly planting and warm. And as a small child, if you were playing in the dirt in the greenhouse and she had done seedlings, you couldn't actually tell. So I remember getting my hand smacked a few times, drying in the dirt, and then told that I ruined cucumbers because I'd gone and drawn on the cucumber bed. That wasn't a very good thing to do. But yes, I mean, she did learn how to love cooking. She taught us sort of shucking peas, or you know, sitting at the kitchen table, and then yeah, taking care of my grandfather. He was 15 years older than her, and he did come down. He had Alzheimer's. And unfortunately she had, she died of pancreatic. But she did everything she did. She didn't do it half. You know, she really put into what she was doing with all of what she was, and I think that's the most important part about what I remember of Marjory.
Well, we have to agree at the museum here too.
And I think if anyone there knows her, you know, or knew of her, she was no nonsense. she put her, this is how it is and this is what I want. And she fluctuated, but she is, I was reading through the Pemberton book, and there's a few bits in here about her family, and you know, I think it is a good thing to keep teaching our children. I mean, my children don't live in the area and only come back to visit, but they know that if there's a local museum, go see the museum. And that's something that you have to keep it alive. You have to keep it alive somehow. And I think Marjory would agree, and Gunnar would as well. He loved his stories. So if he hadn't sat for hours on end telling me about Africa, you know, and the kicker is, at the end of the day, his mother's cousin had written a diary. And with that transcription, we were able to sort of cross-reference his driving exploits. And we're like, yeah, okay, Grandpa. Yeah, you were driving in Paris at 10. Sure. Yeah, I'm sure it was amazing. And then to read it in a diary that was found years later. Oh, huh. So I love the line. He really did drive all over Paris, and Albert got in a lot of trouble for that. But, you know, so, you know, he's like, no, see, there's the photos, and this is what I did. And they went into Africa, and he was describing Africa as a young boy, and just to have that sort of, and this is in 1920, so, you know, you weren't traveling by, you know, car, you were steamship and train and horse and carriage and donkey at one point. Yeah, I think it's just, I'm not sure if they got into any elephants, but it would be in the book if they did. But I do have all of that. Marjory also wrote down sort of a letter to her brother, because her brother passed in 1943 during the Second War. Sort of on his 70th birthday, she wrote a memoir to her brother. So we have a nice capture of how she sort of saw her life. And then she did the same for my grandfather. She wrote his upbringing and his life story. So I think my love of writing also kind of comes from that as well. She thought that was important to capture, as well as the diary to Africa. So we do have a lot of writing that we can sort of have for the museum as well.
Yes, I'm still very much hoping for the Gunnar story.
Yeah, so I mean, it is something that is good, but like I said, still trying to decipher a lot of the family history books. It's pretty awesome.
I just wanted to put it out there. Does anyone have any memories of Gunnar they want to share, or any questions you want to ask?
You might have heard the pancake story in Tanquil. During their honeymoon, he went up, and Teresa Smith or Summerskill and Bert were up there, and I'm not sure, it was one of the Millers. And they went up, and Grandpa and Marjory were leaving, Gunnar and Marjory were leaving Tanquil, and she said, well, I have, you know, stay another night. We're just coming into Tanquil, so it's okay, I'll stay another night. And so the next morning, she says, well, I brought the eggs in the jar. So she cracked all the eggs into the jar and for travel. And he says, well, how many pancakes do you want? He goes, well, how many can you make? I'll eat as many as you can make. He got to 36. And he didn't eat for about 3 days. But, and then he had to climb down. They were on horse, but then they had to come down from Tanquil, and they went to Sissel's, and he was not interested in dinner. But it's a family story, and that recipe managed to make it in here. My cousin transcribed the, if you take 27 eggs, crack them in a jar, look at this many pancakes. And I think Bert got 18 down. So it was, you know, there was a few pancakes on that, but they weren't one to turn down a challenge.
I think a thankful story too, because the seniors all went up to Tanquil one time, and Marjory was amongst them. And they were walking around, everybody's admiring the Heather. She said, yes, we had our honeymoon up here. My oldest daughter's called Heather.
She is, and
But you didn't have that in your family history.
no, it doesn't surprise me though. The dates might work. Yes, I'm sure she would love that. Yes. No, my daughter Marjory went to Tankville last night for the first time ever. And she came back, and it was just like, well, she's grumpy because she's 10, but you could tell she'd really enjoyed it.
That's
So
good.
I'm sure it'll be the first of many. So, yes. No, anyone have any other Marjory or Gunnar story? No, Marjory, smiling in the back there.
We spent many, many, many happy days under the apple tree quilting with Marjorie.
I have a few of her quilts. I've managed to snafu out of my parents' house. Maybe Dad. He's sitting here.
There is a bench on the Shantz house dedicated to Marjory by the Darcy seniors.
No, there's many days. Our home was at the end of the road. We lived, and we'd have to pass the apple tree every day, and the peas. To get to home, and I remember quite distinctly trying to sneak peas without getting caught because my grandmother was sitting under the apple tree having coffee, and I was like, she gonna get out of them? But no, and then the raspberry canes were right next to it, so it was the peas and then the raspberries. So if you were lucky to get raspberries or peas before getting past Granny, who was eagle-eyeing you as you walked down the driveway, because the first 5 plants had nothing on them. Every day we would steal raspberries or peas, or strawberries. She had strawberries in her home too. Granny, do you really need to plant those there? After a few years of us going by, you'd think you'd move them back a little bit. But I think she enjoyed it. I think that was part of her sort of afternoon tea, and she would, you guys would be quilting. There was quite a lot of under the apple tree, and I was actually married under the first apple tree in front of the house. And in my wedding dress, hiked up, I got into the tree because we were never allowed to climb them. So I climbed it in my wedding dress and had a photo done. And I also got in trouble for climbing the cherry tree. I think I left my diaper in it as a small child, so I was always climbing trees.
I wanted to share with you a story a local resident told me. I don't know how true this is, but allegedly they would go to see the dentist, Sigrid, and the reason Sigrid didn't need too many drugs for the dentist's work for her patients is because she had Gunnar, who would stand behind you and hold you down in the chair.
Actually very true. He was a very large man, and he was a very strong man. He would move. If he was holding you to the chair, he probably wouldn't go far. Yeah, I've not heard that, but I wouldn't be surprised.
I wasn't sure if it was just a tall tale.
No, well, it could happen. I'm sure he was big enough. He could have held down a few people in a chair. Yeah. And he was a large Norwegian.
Well, thanks so much for all your research and doing this presentation right after a whirlwind family reunion.
Yeah, and I wish
appreciate it.
If it wasn't for the reunion, my presentation would have been a little longer, a little more organized. I apologize for that. It's just, like I said, organizing 100 people.
Someday in the future, she does have these documents. So Marjorie did take Gunnar's story down before he died. And once she's organized around these items and they're donated to the museum, maybe we have you come back and you could read those stories too.
Oh, I'd love to. We will spell check them, but yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.